Shabbos Kodesh is Lag BaOmer. And I don't know whether the yeshiva, did you have a trip to Lag BaOmer and to Mirana Lag BaOmer? Yes. So this year Lag BaOmer will be somewhat subdued and not as joyful as in normal years. So we will speak about a Minhag Yisrael that was very common in days of yore, today less. So Reb Shmuel Heller was the Rav in Tzfas 150 years ago, and he wrote a Kuntres, Kvoid Malachim. So the first source on our sheet is what he testifies, Meid Ani Be'emes, Ki Be'aldusi, I remember as a child, Shamati Po, Merabonin Kshishoi, Rabbanei HaSfaradim, אשר אבותם ראו וסיפרו להם כי הרב הקודש רב חיים בן עטר. Anybody know who was Reb Chaim ben Atar? The Or HaChaim HaKodesh. היה פעם אחת בהילולה, עיר הקודש צבאס, וכשעולה מירון. So this section was abbreviated, shouldn't have been. כשעולה למירון, he was riding on his mule till the foot of the mountain, and then he got off the mule, and he went up the entire mountain on 4. And he was crying all the way up to the Tzion of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, crying from excitement, from being moved, Bechi Shel Simcha, and the schus to be at the Tzion of the Rashbi. And when he got up to the top of the mountain, he burned precious garments, expensive garments, l'kvoid atano. And that minhag caused a huge debate. And on our sheet we have 3 sources of some of the greatest gedolim that came out against the minhag to burn garments, l'kvoid Reb Shimon. I would start off with the Chassam Sofer in chronological order. יודעתי כי שמעתי שעכשיו אכשיר הדורה וממרך כי יבואו ידרשו את השם בעיר הקודש צבאס ביום ל"ג בעומר, which is somewhat inaccurate. So the Chassam Sofer was in Pressburg. The Chassam Sofer was from, so he didn't use WhatsApp. He didn't even get emails. He heard that in Tzvas, they make a hadlaka, which is probably true, but going back 500 years to the days of the Ari, the main hadlaka was in Miran, not in Tzvas. But the Chassam Sofer writes, I hear that in Tzvas, b'yom lag ba'omer behilule de Rashbi, kol kavanosam l'shem shemayim, schoram rav beli safek, and this is a bit cynical, Al derech v'diguloi. So in Shir Shirim there's a posuk v'diguloi ulai ahava. And the Chassam Sofer writes v'daliko alai ahava, loshen hadloka. So they make a hadloka and they burn garments, v'dilukoi nerois ulai ahava. אבל מטעם זה בעצמו הוא ייסי אני מן הפרושים. ואם הוא ייסי שם, לא ארצה להתחבר עמהם, כי כמה קרקורים קרקר בפרי חודש, בקנטרס מנהוגי איסור שלו. So, the Chassam Sofer writes it's a minhag, but it's a minhag tos, and it's a chashash isor, and I don't agree to this minhag. And even though the Chassam Sofer comes into Kabbalah with the Sheva Sfiros, Hoyt Shebahoyt, Teferes Shebiteferes. But he disagrees with the minhag of burning garments, and he also wonders, what is the Simcha about? If it's the demise, the day of the P'tir of Reb Shimon, it should be a day of Avelis, of mourning, not a day of Simcha. Chronologically, then comes the Chikrei Lev. Chikrei was one of the great Sephardi poskim. Any moitze bezet tzad heter. דנרא דאיקר איסור בל תשחס דרבנן אפילו בשמחס בייס השי ולא היו מדליקים כי הם מבלועים מכנסי הכהנים. ואם שיודעתי גדלס רשב"י בשמיים ממעל ועל האורץ, מי אני לדבר בדובר בנגיע לכבודוי? אך יודעתי כי לא לפוניו חנף יבוי, וליבי יאמר לי, אין רצוני בכך. Reb Shimon wouldn't agree. If he would have his say, he wouldn't agree they should burn precious garments. Is that so? Shoyna Meishiv, Reb Yosef Shul Natan zon. Mo eser ki be'avonesenu harabim lo yishma'u b'ze be'kol ha'moirim. וכבר אמרו כשם שמצווה אלוהים מדברי נשמע, מצווה אלוהים משלו אינו מדבר שאין נשמע. ובפרט בדבר שנהגו וחושבים ההמון שמצווה הם עושים. קשה לפרוש, יסוד קדושים, רוצים לזכות במצווה. ופשיטה שבימי הרי ושאר קדושים מה שבורס לא היו עושים. רק לימוד על קברוי ותפילס ותחנונים, שבמויסוי, וביום זה יסוד רחמם על ישראל, ופשיטה שבסיוסי וסייעתו לא היו מניחים לעשות זאת. רק אחר כך נספש את המנהג, ואחר כך חשבו למנהג קדום. אני עורב להם שהם היו לוקחים אותו ממון והיו מפרנסים עניי ארץ ישראל, שיוסר לא יוניחה לרשב"י. So the Shalom Eishav also comes out against this minhag, and he also doesn't understand what's the simcha. And he writes, I am sure that in days of Dari, they didn't dance, they didn't sing, they didn't rejoice. They davened and learned on his kever. The Beis Yosef wouldn't let such a minhag take place. B'mechila mikvoi teirosam. In Shara Kavonis, it is written that the Ari came Lag Ba'omer to the Hadloka, and he made a chalaka for his child. V'samach simcha gedoylo. Yes, and that was in the days of the Beis Yosef. And we're not aware that the Beis Yosef objected to these minhagim. So the Shalom Eishav kvoidei b'mkoi memunach. But obviously he wasn't very familiar in Shara Kavonas and Kizvei Ari. And it is written in Shara Kavonis, there was a big tzaddik in the days of Dari. His name was Rabbi Avraham Alevi. And all year round he said Nachem, because he still strongly felt Chorban Beis HaMikdash. And he said Nachem and Lag Ba'omer. And the Rashbi came to the Ari to complain. What's happening with Rabbi Avraham Alevi? He said Nachem on the day of my Simcha, U'avoido Shiur benachama. And his child passed away within 30 days, and he was Makabel Tanchumim. Rabbi Avraham Alevi, and that was a kpeda of the Rashbi that he said Nachem and Lag Ba'omer. So it's quite obvious, not only the Ari thought that this is a day to rejoice, the Rashbi felt the same. So I doubt if we would ask Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, like the Shalom Eishav recommends, do you prefer we take the money and give it to Aniyim? He probably would say no. I prefer come to Miran, dance and sing. So the Chassam Sofer also says, I don't think Reb Shimon has nachas from this. He does. He himself said so. And the Ari was rejoicing in Lag Ba'omer. So let us briefly discuss, so how about Bal Tashchis? The Sdei Chemed has a big arichas. Tiny little letters. I would have difficulty reading it, but you could. Sefer Torah Lishma. Does anybody know who wrote the Sefer Torah Lishma? Shalas Yeshuvas Torah Lishma. Who's the Torah Lishma? Rabbi Cheskel Kachali, שלא היה ולא נברא ואינו אלא משל. So many Gedolei Yisrael published this form anonymously without their names, but I know of no other precedent that a Gedolei Yisrael was Mafasam a Sefer with a false name. So the Ben Ish Chai wrote the Sefer beyond doubt, but the name in which he penned this Sefer is Yecheskel Kachali. Nobody knows why. So this is a sefer of the Ben Ish Chai. And we're reading a very short paragraph. Teida, ki minhag Yisrael Torah, שהולכים בלילה בעומר למירון ושם מדליקים חתיכות בגדים חשובים לכבוד הרשמי ואין לפקפק על זה מאחר שמסחברים לשם מצווה אין כאן חשש בל תסחס ומנהג ישראל תוירי ועוד תדע שהרי נוהגים להדליק כמה נרס בבית הכנסת ביום ואף על פי שאין המקום מאיר באוירם ואם כל זה אין בזה חשש בל תשחס מפני שמדליקים לכבוד בית הכנסת או לכבוד הצדיקים ועושים לשם מצווה לא חשורי וידון הוכה ודע כי אם עיקור אין כאן איסור בל תשחס מן התועלה מדרבנן כמו שכוסף הרמב"ם בל תשחס אין אלא בשחוסס אלוניס ולא במשאבי כלים. Could anybody argue against the raya of the Sdei Chemed? The Sdei Chemed writes, we're madlik kama v'kama neiros l'chvoid beis hakneses, and we don't really need the light. We have electricity. But still, so why isn't it Baltashchis? If you light 10 candles to be Mekayim the Minhag Yisrael, it's enough to light 1 candle. So that's not Baltashchis. Is it the same? Or could someone argue it's not the same? And even though we would disagree to burning garments, but you still are allowed to put on 10 candles instead of 1. What do you think? So like Rabbi says, candles are candles, meant to burn. Garments are garments, meant to wear. So it's not really a dimyan. And then the Ben Ish Chai writes, just Baltashchis midrabanan. So I have a big argument with many Gedolim. Kosav Rambam Perek Vav Melchus Malachim Halacha Ches. Is it the Uraisa to destroy any fruit-bearing tree? That's a posuk. Ki savoi כסיבן המוצר אלוהיה, לא תשחס את העצה. וכל המשחס אילן פרי לויקה. And then the Rambam writes, הלוך יוד, פרק ו' הלוך יוד, ולוי אילונויס בלבד, אלא כל המשבר כלם, וקורע בגודים, והורס בניין, וסותם מעיין, ומאבד אוכלים דרך השחוסה, עובר Beloi tashkes. Veloike makas mardas. Midivreihem. So there seems to be a contradiction in the Rambam. The Rambam writes on one hand, Oive beloi tashkes. So why is there only makas mardas? Seems to be a contradiction. I think most Gedolim understood if it's makas mardas, it's only in a sederabonon. And that is why when you destroy a fruit tree, loika, that's makas arboim. But all the other things, it's only miderabonon. But the Rambam writes, oiver beloi tashchis. And the Rambam writes this once again in Sefer HaMitzvahs, oiver beloi tashchis. Mahari Basan, Kuf Yud Aleph. Noide biyude tinyone yorodei simen yud. Chayodem hilchas tzitzis, which is somewhat of a chiddush. Simen lamed beis. Chayodem writes, destroying tzitzis is only in a sederabanan. And therefore, if you have a telescope or a telescope for years, and you want to have new tzitzis, even though your old tzitzis are still kosher, you are entitled to cut them off and put them in Geniza if you want new tzitzis. And that wouldn't be Baltashchis. Especially, it's only Baltashchis Derabanan, because the Rambam writes it's Makas Mardas. Minchas Osha Bereishis Samach Vov, I wrote a Klal Godol. And I recommend the Lamdim amongst you. It's Kedai to learn. I think it's the last Ois, Minchas Osha Bereishis Samach Vov. And I brought many sources, a gewaldige chiddush that we find in the Rambam. And I wonder, this is such a big chiddush, why the Achronim just didn't notice it and didn't talk about it barichas. במצווה התורה, בין מצוות עשה ובין מצוות לא תעשה, יש עיקר ותוספת. I never use the terms עיקר ותופל. אין בתורת השם תמימו תופל. I prefer the terminology עיקר ותוספת. And the Rambam regarding מצוות לא תעשה, אין מלכס אלו על מה שמפורש בתורה. Everything else that's included in the law, even though it's min ha-Torah, not midrabanan. Ein malchus elo ma shemefurash b'Torah. And I brought kama v'kama sources in the Rambam. The same Baltashchas. The Rambam writes, both in Sefer HaMitzvahs and in Mishnah Torah, oiver beloi tashchas. So why isn't there malchus? Masha kosav b'Torah lo tashchis es eitzo. Chazal, Ruach Kodsham, Oimeg Bino, some say, why would there be a difference between trees and begodim, or buildings, or food? No difference. Anything you destroy, which is fitting for use, and people could enjoy or benefit from, is Enisat Yoraisa Baltashchas. But Malchus, only on Eitz Machal, only on a fruit tree, because that's Mafurish B'Torah. But anyway, this was a huge discussion. So let me just quote two sources before speaking about the essence of Lag BaOmer. There's some Sof in the Sholem Eshev wonder, first of all, what's the Simcha? How could the day in which a tzaddik passed away and left us be a simcha? Zayin Odo is the Yotzat of Moshe Rabbeinu, and it's the day of Avelus. Many people fast Zayin Odo. So why is it a simcha? Shem Aryeh, Reb Aryeh Leibish Balchover, it's an amazing sefer. Or Chaim Simen Yudalet, he writes a very posheta explanation. So you know this story of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Why did he go to a cave? Why did Reb Shimon Bar Yochai decide? Was he a hermit? Were too many people coming by Kabbalat Kahal every morning? Or why did he decide to go to a cave? Do you remember the story in Shabbos Lamed Gimel Omed Beis? Three of the greatest Tanoim were sitting and just having a discussion about the Romans. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, and Reb Shimon. It's noteworthy, they were all Rabbi Seinu Shebedorim, the great Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yehuda praised the Romans. He said, they're great, they do so much for the community. Look at the buildings they build and the Colosseums, and they really care for the people. Rabbi Yossi, I wouldn't say he was the smartest. How could one say these were Malachei Elyon, these were the greatest Tanoim? But in this event, probably he was the wisest. He just said nothing. Pelech Hashtika. Arab Shimon lambasted the Romans, and he said they're awful people, and they do nothing for the Jews, and they don't care about anyone, only about themselves. Yehuda ben Gadim was there. We don't know much about Yehuda ben Gadim, but he was the one that got the word out, and the Romans heard about this conversation. So they promoted Rabbi Yehuda, they exiled Rabbi Yossi, and there was a death warrant against Rabbi Shimon. And the Romans were after him. The CIA and the FBI and the FSB, I think, the Russians, whatever it's called. And Rabbi Shimon had to flee, and that is how we got to the matter with Rabbi Elazar ben Noi. So the Shem Aryeh writes, it's a gewaldige simcha that the Romans were not successful in taking Reb Shimon and murdering him. And in the Idra Zut is part of the Zohar, and there's a stirring description of the last day of Reb Shimon. In his last day, he was surrounded with his greatest Talmidim, and he was Megalas Soides HaTorah that were never known before, So isn't that a reason to rejoice? That he wasn't murdered like Rabbi Kiva, he wasn't tortured, Meis bekovet Godel, surrounded with his greatest Talmidim and his family and Rabbi Loza, his son, and he was Megalas Sisra Torah, and that is why the Yortzeit of Reb Shimon is a Gavaldige Simcha, and that's Pashtus. And then another thought, which is a profound thought of Reb Shiur Mekutna. I wouldn't understand anybody to know who was Reb Shiur Mekutna. He's one of the greatest Gedolim in Poland. He had 3 names, Yisrael, Yoshua, Eliyahu. And his father named him after the Baal Shem Tov, the Vilna Gaon, and the Pnei Yeshua. Nobody ever put together a better coalition than that. The Baal Shem Tov, the Vilna Gaon, and the Pnei Yeshua. That was his name. Is that the reason he ultimately grew to be one of the greatest Gedolim in Poland, maybe? I know some people that have great names, and not always did they materialize and become the Gedolei Ador. But Reb Shiur Mekutna was one of the Gedolei Ador in Poland. And he writes a thought. Why do we burn Dafka Begodim? Lechvoid Rabbi Shimon. You know, under the chuppah you break a glass. What's the meaning of Sreifas Begodim? Shabbos Lamed Gimel, when Chazal tell the story of Reb Shimon, they used to take their begodim off. They used to undress and be covered in sand till their necks. And that is how they learned Torah. So he suggests maybe that's a remez, that in the Mara Reb Shimon and Rabbi Loza were nes'ala b'malas at like Odom Harishon Koydem Achet. Odom V'chava Koydem Achet didn't need any garments. They were so holy. There was no tumah, there was no erva. And that's the remez, why they learn Torah without garments. And that is why we burn garments, that is the remez, the same reason they took off their garments when they learned Torah in the Mara. And that is a remez that they were elevated to the highest level of Kedusha one could just imagine, like Odom V'chava Koydem Achet. So those are some thoughts to be miyashiv, the kasha. Why do we burn clothes? So the Torah Lishma says, if you have good intentions, that's not an aveira at all. Just like breaking a glass under a chuppah. Where does this minhag come from? In Brochas Lamed Aleph, the Gemara says that Mar, Brei de Ravuna, broke a glass at his son's wedding. And Tosfos on the spot says, this is the source of the minhag to break clay schuchis by a chuppah. And the Ramah twice in Shulchan Aruch brings this minhag. It's interesting that Beis Yosef does not bring it, and I don't think the Sfardim do it, but it's a minhag Ashkenaz. Tov Kuf Samach in Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, Samach in Shulchan Aruch Even HaEzer. So what is the justification? Why isn't it Baltashchis? If the kavana is at the height of Simcha, we want to remember Chor Mabayis, then that justifies breaking a glass, and it's not Baltashchis. So whenever Yidnar Mechavan Hashem Shemayim, and it's a minhag vasikin, and it has a rationale, that's not Baltashchis. And if there is an inyan to burn garments l'chvoid Reb Shimon, either as an expression of grief, or any other reasoning, l'chvoid Reb Shimon, and we do find the din in Avodah Zarah Yud Gimel, Sorfen al HaMelachim. When kings passed away, they used to burn their garments. And the Gemara says, it's not b'chukor se'em lo yitalechu, because we find it in the Navi. We find it in our sources. So that would explain, without Reb Shiur Mekutna, even b'derech hapshat, yes, it is lechvoid atana, and therefore it would not be Baltashchis. So we had a brief discussion about Baltashchis and about the minhag of Simcha Lag BaOmer. So most of the Gedolei Adoros, both those that supported the Simcha and both those that came out against it, assumed that the Simcha Lag BaOmer is because it's the Yortzeit of Reb Shimon. But we find many other reasons for the Simcha of Lag BaOmer. Siman Tov Tzad Gimel Shulchan Aruch, we find that the plague was over Lag BaOmer. And that is why it's a Yom Simcha. It has nothing to do with Reb Shimon. It has to do with Rabbi Akiva, 24,000 Talmidim that perished, and Rabbi Stein Shebedurim that survived. But I want to share with you a totally different approach to Lag BaOmer. And the Chassam Sofer actually alludes to this. This is an amazing tshuva written very bekitzer with big chidushim. So he quotes Rabbi Yankov Emden. Let me just find it. He quotes Rabbi Yankov Emden. What is unique about Lag BaOmer? Ubesidur hayavitz. 7 lines from the top. Tame gufei lo yodana. I don't know what's the simcha. Ubesidur hayavitz. Kosav alpinistar. Da'ave kebeizin shekiloi chayiv v'have zakai. Dahainu hoid shebahoid. Ayin sham. The Yankov Emden in a Siddur writes, Lag BaOmer is an awful day of Midas Adin. It's the harshest Midas Adin. And if it's so bad, it's got to be good. Sanhedrin Daf Yud Zayin, the Gemara says, when a Beis Din Shalachov Gimel is dan dinin nefoshes, and all the 23 Dayonim agree that this person should be put to death, either skil or slave or hereg or cherek, and not even one dayan could see a reason for leniency, poitre moisoi, we send him home, and he's not punished. It's not the right format right now to go into a halachic discussion. How do we understand this halacha? But the Rebbe Yankov Emden talks b'derech Kabbalah. Just like when the verdict is so harsh, not even one dayan could see a reason for leniency. Everybody says this person is a Rasha and he should be put to death. Then we say, no, it can't be that bad. And when things get so bad, they need to be good. So Rabbi Yankov Emden says, Lag BaOmer is such a harsh day of Midas Adin, it's got to be good. And that's why we dance and sing. Is anybody familiar with the Sefer Tzroyer HaMoyer? Today I'm giving you some hard questions. Tzroyer HaMoyer goes back almost 400 years to Rabbi Avram Saba. I think he was one of the Gedolim in Italy, primary Mekubal. In Pasha Semoy, he writes the same thought, and he speaks about a Tolam Tilam. Besoy Galav ato tishabreim. Galov is Gimalamed, it's a remez of Lag BaOmer. So when there's a turbulent sea, and there are awful swells and waves, and in Lashon Kodesh, agal nishbar, the wave breaks. I don't know whether that expression is used in English as well. So he says, B'soy galav, ato teshabreim. So when the galim, when the waves and the swells are so bad, Kodesh Baruch Hu breaks them. And B'soy galav, gal is a remez of Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer things get so bad that a Kodesh Baruch Hu must intervene. And Midas Adin breaks, and Rachmim takes over. So in Shara Kavonos Drush Yud Beis, I want to share with you some interesting thoughts. The Riyah Kodesh says, Elokim is the Shem of Midas Adin. Everybody's familiar with that. Yud Kevov Ke is Rachamim, Elokim is Din. When Din is transformed into Rachamim, Elokim is transformed into Hashem Achdatam. The 3 inner letters, Lamed Hayud, move back. The Lamed becomes a Chaf, the Hey becomes a Daled, the Yud becomes a Tes. Elohim is transformed into Achdatam. So the Ri says the 3 middle letters, that transformed into Rachamim are Begematria Lamed Gimel. Chaf, Daled, 24 plus 9, 33. Achdatam is Begematria 74. And that is Eid Hagal Hazeh. Eid is 74, Achdatam, Gal is 33. The inner three letters that transformed him into Rachamim. And I add on to the Ari, Zeh is 12. And that is the numerical difference between Elokim and Achdatam. So Eid Hagal Hazeh is a remez to the transformation of Midas Adin into Midas Arachamim. V'Yankov Koroloi Gal Eid. Gal Eid is Achdatam, is the Eid, and the Gal is Lag Ba'omer. That is when Elokim becomes Achdatam. These three letters, and this is also my edition, Chof Dalates are the Rosh Tevis of Ki Toivim Doidecha. Yishukeinu min Ashikas Piyu, Ki Toivim Doidecha Miyayin. Shira Shirim is the ultimate sefer of Ahava and Rachamim and Chemlo. Hasidim say a whole bunch of things after Sviras Uoimer. You say it in yeshiva? Don't know whether it's a Hasidic yeshiva or a Litvish yeshiva. The Rosh Yeshiva is a descendant of the greatest Hasidic Rabbeim. So, we say, Lama Natseach ben Aginois. Why do we choose this Perek and Tillim out of all the 150 prokim? It has exactly 49 words, coinciding with 49 days of Sfira. Could that be the reason we choose this Perek and Tehillim? Of course not. There must be some pnimius. 49 words in this Perek. If you count, number 33 is Elokim. Yedichu Amem Elokim. Elokim is Lag Boima. That is Midas Adin. And Midas Adin is so harsh, so bad, Kodesh Baruch Hu turns it into Rachamim. And that is when Elokim turns into Achdatam. So the Chiddush in Rabbi Yankov Emden and the Ari is that Lag Boim is a wonderful day, not because wonderful things happened in this day. It's the other way around. Because this is such a special day, that is why so many remarkable events happened in this day. So that's the day Reb Shimon Ora B'Sar Shamayim. That is the day Posco Amegefa. That is the day in which Reb Shimon started teaching Torah to Rabbi Seinu Shebedorim. So it's not a day to rejoice because wonderful events happened in that day. The reason these events happened in that day is because all the Yemei Sfira, this is the day in which then is transformed to Rachamim. Ramban ala Torah, Parshas V'Zoysa Brocha, and the Posuk, Mi Yaminoi Eish Das Lamoi, the Ramban writes, there's a contradiction in this Posuk. Yamin and Small, what's your guess? Which is Din and which is Rachamim? Yamin and Small. Small Doicha, Yamin Mekareves. Small is Din, Yamin is Rachamim. Eish V'Mayim, this is a tougher guess. Which is Din, which is Rachamim? Fire and water. Mayim is Rachamim. Good guess. So the Ramban says, so how does Yamin go together with Eish? Why would it be Miyaminoi, Eish Das Lamoi? The Ramban writes, Yesh bezeh soid godol, shemidas adin klula barachamim. In Pnimius, din is always rachamim. And that is why I feel, how is Elokim transformed to rachamim? Not the Aleph, not the Mem, the Pnimius, the three letters that are Oisius Apnimios. They're the ones that transformed into Rachamim. In Sidur Hagra, Kedusha de Sidra. Anybody know what is Kedusha de Sidra? You happen to answer all my questions. I assume it's just because you're closest to me. Probably all the others know as well. In Kedusha de Sidra, on the Posek, Begvuris Yesha Yeminoi, the Goan says, Yemin is Rachamim. Gvuris is Din. The greatest Rachamim are when Din inspires Rachamim. The greatest Midas Rachamim are the Rachamim Sheyoitzim Etorich Adinim. And that is why we say Mechal Kel Chayim Bechesed and Birchas HaGvuros, because Begvuros Yesha Yeminoi. So that happens on Lag BaOmer. The greatest Rachamim are when Elokim is transformed and Midas Adin is Mashpia Rachamim. And that happens every year on Lag BaOmer. So hundreds of thousands of Yidden go every year to Miron. This year, it'll be impossible. Ma'orei Naim, I think the Rashiv is an anacle of the Ma'orei Naim. Ma'orei Naim, at the end of the Sefer, there's a kuntres, I think it's called Yismach Leiv, Amesechtes. Shabbos Lamed Gimeli writes, if you can't be at the kever, learn Reb Shimon's Torah. And when you learn his Torah, it is as if you're at the kever and your tefillas on his gabel. I would suggest, I don't give eitzes to the Rosh Hashiva in public, but I think Lag BaOmer, you should learn in yeshiva, Brich Shemei, and Kigavno. These are two short prokem in the Zohar that we constantly say. 3 times a week we say Brich Shemei. Once a week we say Kigavno. It's an Inyan Godel to learn Zohar Lag BaOmer. And I think it would enhance your tefillas. When you say Kigavno, when you say Brich Shemei, you know what you're talking about. And Lag BaOmer is a Sgula Gedola to learn Reb Shimon's Torah. The Sefer Hasidim writes that whenever we quote Divrei Torah from one of the great Gedolim, that Godel davens for us up there in Gan Eden. Maybe that's why I like to quote a lot of sources in my Shiurim, because I need a lot of tefillas and a lot of brachas, and I hope all those Gedolim will do something for me. We should be able for many years to keep on Lahagdul Torah Uladina. So this year, if we're not going to Lag BaOmer, we're going to learn Reb Shimon's Torah, and let us hope that Midas Adin will be Nefach L'Rachamim, because this is definitely a period of Midas Adin, terrible Midas Adin. So the past Friday, I had an amazing experience together with the Rosh Hashiva. We went to visit a young soldier. I'm not mentioning his name because, this is very private. We went to visit a young soldier that we both know. Soldier that lost both legs and an arm in this terrible war. We visited this young soldier. He asked me some questions. One would imagine, what would he ask you? Why do I deserve this? Tzadik v'ra'aloi. No. He asked me one question about Hanochas Tefillin. He just has part of his right arm. Is that now Yad Keho? So on which arm does he put on Tefillin? And then he wants to know, he has very limited use of what was left of his right arm. Does he need to do Netilas Yadayim? And I lift my eyes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and I say, Rabbeinu Shalom, Mikam Chi Yisrael. Mikam Chi Yisrael. If this young soldier, Chas v'Shalom, would become an apikoiris, no one could judge him. Al todnas chaveich ad shetagiya ram koimai. No. What troubles him is Hanochas Tefillin, Netilas Yadayim, Netilas Lulav, Mikam Chi Yisrael. So we daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rabbeinu Shalom. Who knows? Maybe it's enough. Enough tsar, enough pain, enough suffering, and maybe time has come. We should see Nisim and Yeshuas. So maybe this wonderful day of Lag BaOmer, which has a special zgila that Midas Adin is Nefach L'Rachamim, שהקדוש ברוך הוא ירחם עלינו. We should only be zoichet uracham mishamayim. And the schus of the Tana Hu Eloki, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Reb Shimon Bar Yochai said, Yochanan lifted us kol oilem min adin. Kadosh Baruch Hu take away midas adin. So Reb Shimon, let's see. Prove it. You said Yochanan lifted us kol oilem min adin. So Kadosh Baruch Hu lifted us kol am Yisrael min adin. And midas adin should be nefach larachamim, and we should only hear b'soides toivos, Yeshuas v'nachames. והקדוש ברוך הוא ישלח לנו משיח צדקנו במהרה ויומנו אמן.